Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the second lecture in our series, which is sponsored by a Cheryl K. Coleman and Margaret E. Guiteau Professorship at the Oregon Humanities Center. The professorship is providing enrichment opportunities for my course about ancient Jewish art and architecture, and I'd like to thank the Oregon Humanities Center for its support. Today, Stephen Fine will be speaking to us. He is Churgin Professor of Jewish History at Yeshiva University and the Director of the Yeshiva University Center for Israel Studies. His research focuses on the literature, art, and archaeology of ancient Judaism. He is the author of several books, including Art and Judaism in the Greco-Roman World, Art History and the Historiography of Judaism in the Greco-Roman World, and The Menorah from the Bible to Modern Israel. He has received several honors and awards. Most notably, he has received the Jordan Snitzer Book Award from the Association for Jewish Studies, the Philip Johnson Award for Excellence in Published Exhibition Catalogs from the Society of Architectural Historians, and the Samaritan Medal for Peace and Human Achievement. I am thrilled that he will give today's lecture entitled Jews, Samaritans, and the Art of the Ancient Synagogue. Please welcome Professor Fine.
Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to see you. I'm happy to see old friends. I'm happy to see all of you students. Thank you for inviting me digitally to Oregon. I'd like to ask students, if you'd please, as we're speaking, as I'm speaking, write down things you want to talk about later so that we can be sure to have a robust conversation. Because after all, you all could read my books or watch my videos. You don't need me, but we're really here for us to have a conversation. So please be sure to write things down that you'd like to talk to me about, okay? Now, let me put up some slides, and then we're starting. Start broadcast. Boom, slides. Hooray for Hollywood. Boom, play. Now, I know this is a course in Jewish art, but the reality is that I'm not talking so much about Jews. Instead, I'm going to take us through the Jewish synagogue into the Samaritan synagogue and back again. Now, the Samaritans, as you may know, are a small people. Today they're 850, but that's good. In 1900, they were 116. There were a lot of them in the ancient world. We don't know how many because we don't know ever how many of anybody there really is, but there were a lot of them. They are descendants of the northern tribes of Israel, of Ephraim and Manasseh, and of Levi, the priest. They are similar to Jews and not similar to Jews. I like to say that they're not Jews or Palestinians, but they're Jews and Palestinians in both at the same time. How is that? The Samaritans, whose holy mountain is Mount Gerizim, above modern Nablus, ancient Shechem or Neapolis, are the what's left of the northern tribes of Israel. They have a Torah that's similar to the Jewish Torah. They have traditions similar to Jewish traditions. They had a sacrificial precinct, which is they call it, but we would probably call it a temple, right here on the top of their holy mountain that hovers above the West Bank, that hovers above Nablus. What you see here in the forefront are the 6th to 5th century remains of the Samaritan Temples city that was destroyed in 110 by the Hasmonean king, John Hyrcanus II. Up on the top, you see a octagonal building that was built first by the Emperor Zenon in the 5th century and then on to the Emperor Justinian century later. The Samaritans are a unique case. In scholarship, we've done a lot of work to compare Judaism and Jewish material culture to the Roman context, which makes a lot of sense, and to the Christian context that makes a lot of sense. But there's been frightfully little work on the Samaritan context, which is really odd, because the Samaritans are another group of Israelites. They're not non-Israelites, right? Jews and Samaritans are cousins. They're Israel of the flesh, if you will, just as Jews are Israel of the flesh, as opposed to Christianity, Israel of the spirit. They are another large group in late antique Palestine that was under the thumb of imperial Christianity through late antiquity. And so they're a wonderful, parallel, interesting place to think about what it means to be sacred architecture, what religion is, what communications are. And unlike most other peoples in the Mediterranean world, you can still talk to them. After all, you can't go talk to Scythians and you can't go talk to folks in the Punic colonies, but you can talk to Jews and Samaritans. And sometimes they'll even talk back in ways that are meaningful for our scholarly project. Now, the Samaritan Center, of course, is on Mount Gerizim in the central hill country of the Holy Land. But in antiquity, we have evidence of Samaritan communities as far west as Rome and Syracuse, Thessalonica, Delos, and other places which we know of from literary sources. And so they had a large diaspora, large dispersion, as Jews had a large dispersion through this period. And what we're going to see is almost at times two groups that are attached at the hip all the way through the ancient world, which makes it that much more interesting as a comparative point of discussion. So take a look at this. This is a stone which you can visit in Delos, which is a trade island off in the Aegean. And on Delos, there were a series of these stelae that were found. This one's about 18 inches tall. It looks much more impressive. With a wreath on it, it's standard equipment for the 2nd century before the Common Era. And there were 2 of them found there on an island where folks have always said there was a Jewish synagogue. Now, we have no real strong archaeological evidence for a Jewish synagogue on Delos in the 2nd century BCE, but we do have these stelae. And let's take a look what they say. The Israelites on Delos who make offering to the temple on Gerizim. Notice Gerizim, that's like Armageddon, the mountain of Megiddo. It's standard, again, ancient Jewish, ancient Israelite language. What do they do? With a gold wreath crown Serapion, son of Jason, of Knossos. Now, I don't know if he's Samaritan or if he's not. If he's Samaritan, that's another Samaritan community. If he's not Samaritan, he's Jason from Knossos. For his benefaction toward them. Amazing. Here we have in the 2nd century BCE, Israelites on Delos, on this trade island, self-identifying as those who sent offerings to the temple on Mount Gerizim, which was destroyed around 110 BCE. So you get a sense of historical context. Now, everything else that we're going to look at, everything else that we're going to look at, why doesn't this go away when I tell it to? There it goes, is late antique, meaning 4th to 6th century. So I'm not going to keep giving dates all the way through, okay? Like this stone that was found in Syracuse, in Sicily, which has a pretty ugly inscription on it. If you take a look at the Samaritan up above, you have to believe me, it's a pretty ugly Samaritan inscription. It's someone who doesn't really write Samaritan very well. Samaritan script is the ancient biblical script before the coming of the Aramaic script in the 5th century or so, and its adoption by Jews. Samaritans generally didn't adopt it, and certainly in late antiquity didn't adopt this Jewish script, this script that was used by Jews as well. Part of their self-differentiation was through script, just as the Jewish self-definition was through script. What did they write on this column? And you see two sides of it. It's only one column. Kuma Hashem, Kuma Shema, as they say, Vayafutsu Ivecha. Arise, O Lord, and disperse your enemies. Someone there is thinking that he made a mistake in the pronunciation of the word Ivecha. In fact, I didn't. In Jewish Hebrew, in the Jewish Bible, it reads as Oivecha. In the Samaritan, the term is with a yud rather than a vav, Ivecha. But it shows how close these communities are, that they're using the same text. This term is used over and over again in Samaritan inscriptions all over the Mediterranean world as it's used in their liturgy. This is my favorite. This is from Thessalonica. Again, another late antique text. On the upper line, you can see Samaritan. Oh, let's get it. Let's do the lower one. And on the lower line, you can see Samaritan, but you can see that the Samaritan script, even if you can't read it, is far less secure. The hand is far less secure, far less deep, far less sure of what he's doing than the Greek hand. And what do they write in Greek? A liturgical refrain. Blessed is our God forever. Then it goes on with the priestly blessing in number 6 and ends with God is one, which is a phrase we're going to see over and over again, estheos. A blessing to Syracuse, who has made this with his wife and children. Prosper, Neapolis, with those who love you. Now, I point out that in late antiquity, Samaritans referred to their holy city, Shechem or Shechem, as Neapolis, just as Jews often referred to Jerusalem as Aelia, from Aelia Capitolina, the pagan city built there by Hadrian. Okay. Let's go back to the map. What you see here is central Israel, West Bank area. But what I'm interested in pointing out is the range of Samaritan populations in Judea. And so whether from Shalavim or Amayos, which is just next to the M of Shalavim, or down below near Beit Guvrin, just above, at Na'an, we have Samaritan communities from late antiquity, but their main center, of course, is Mount Gerizim, Neapolis, and synagogues surrounding it, going over to the coastline at Herzliya down to Ramat Aviv. We have a huge Samaritan population in southern Judea that, for those who do Jewish history, spread into the Shvela, between the destruction of the temple in 70 and the Bar Kokhba revolt, more or less. And at Amayos, it's a famous city from the New Testament and from rabbinic literature, this wonderful Ionic capital was found with a Samaritan inscription on it. It's now at the Carmelite nunnery in Bethlehem. It took some effort to find it. And it says on it, Uvaruch Shemo Le'olam, and blessed is his name eternally. And on the back, Eis Theos. Remember, we saw Eis Theos, one God, on the previous inscription from Thessalonica. One God, which is never used by Jews, but is often used by Christians. In this context, when used in sites that are not obviously Christian within this region, often denotes Samaritans. So, for example, here are two more inscriptions. The one up on the left is from Shalavim, which is in the coastal plain on the road to Jerusalem. And it's very valuable to us, first because of the inscription, which refers to the synagogue as an ukterion, a prayer place. So now we have a name for these institutions. Samaritans in late antiquity, we don't know what they called their synagogues. We know what Jews called them, Beit Knesset, but Samaritans didn't leave for us enough late antique text to tell us exactly what terms they use. It may be Beit Safra, the house of the book. It could be mikdash. These are terms that they used by the early Middle Ages, but we don't know exactly what they're referred to. So when we refer to a Samaritan synagogue as a synagogue, we don't know for sure that they called it a kanishta, as they do in Aramaic later on, or as Jews did in late antiquity, but it's a good bet. Now, but we do know that in Greek, these people referred to it as a prayer place. And what you see beneath the Greek inscription are two menorahs framing a thing that looks like a stepped pyramid, kind of a ziggurat looking thing, which the excavator in 1949, E.L. Sukanik, thought was an image of Mount Gerizim, which isn't a bad guess. The holy mountain, the blessed mountain, the beautiful mountain, the place where God caused his tabernacle to rest, the place where Abraham almost sacrificed his son Isaac, the place where the Ark of Noah finally rested on the highest mountain in the region. Anything you can think about Jerusalem, the Samaritans said about Mount Gerizim, and that was a good piece of the polemic between the two communities. And an inscription on the floor in Samaritan, Shema Yimloch Olam Va'ed. The Lord will rule eternally. Notice that again, that it's different from the Jewish text, but only marginally. Which the Jewish text is, the Lord will reign for eternity, le'olam. Now, what's interesting about this mosaic beyond all else is that the people in Shalavim, whomever they were, built themselves a small synagogue, seem to have referenced Mount Gerizim, and used a menorah as a Samaritan symbol. That means that not every menorah that you come across is going to be a Jewish menorah. And we're going to come back to that. Samaritan script became an important symbol, just as Aramaic script among Jews, the Jewish script, became a symbol and a marker of community. So at Ramat Aviv, on the grounds of what's now the Land of Israel Museum, a mosaic was discovered, literally on the shores of the Archon, that says as follows: Maximus be remembered because he is honored. Prochenos be remembered because he is honored. You notice it's written in Samaritan script. Problem is that it's not in Samaritan. It's written in Greek, in Samaritan script. These people were not terribly learned in Samaritanism in the 5th and 6th centuries when this was built. And this happens a lot in Samaritan inscriptions. They want the look of Samaritan, but they don't have the content. There's something going on with this Greek-speaking set of communities. And we know Jews are going through the same process. And so, for example, rabbinic literature describes that at Caesarea, there are people who couldn't pronounce Hero Israel, Shema Yisrael, in Hebrew. And we know that in Western culture, in Western diaspora communities, Hebrew was a rarity, though less of a rarity than the previous generation of scholars thought. At the Sardis synagogue, for example, in Asia Minor, a number of Hebrew inscriptions were found, which were discounted and published separately. When read among all the inscriptions from Sardis, there is a ritualized use of Hebrew that hadn't been noticed before. And so these people at Ramat Aviv were using their script, but they didn't really know what they were doing. Now, similarly at Apoglia, which is north of Herzliya today, Crusader Castle, Arshuf, this inscription was discovered. It starts out, Es Theos Monos. Now, it's not enough to say one God. You have to say one and only God. In other words, there's an expansion of language. And then it mentions all these people with perfectly good non-Israelite names, right? Gedonia and Julia, absolutely standard names for their world. Now, underneath this inscription, there are a bunch of Aramaic letters. Now, if you look at these letters, they're pretty ugly. The Greek, he knew what he was doing. But the Samaritan script, I think that the people who excavated this had to be geniuses to figure out what's possible for those letters. And Orenthal, who was the leader of this excavation, came up with the letters that you see there. Pei, Ayin, Lamed, Hey, Bet, Dalet, Hey. Now, the discussion that Tal wrote, trying to figure out what this meant, is enough to fill a good academic article, and I'm not doing it justice. But he tried to interpret it as Pa'alei Bidei. He made it of his own, or in this place, or something. That's what Bidai, I guess he's doing it. He made it from his possessions in this place. The reason I mention him and go into all this effort about this inscription is because I don't quite buy the interpretation, but I don't have a better one. It shows you that, again, we have a group of Samaritans on the coast that are pretty good in Greek. Similarly, at Nana, these artifacts were taken from, at front of the end of the 19th century, and taken to the Louvre, a capital that says one God, and a plate with the image of a Torah scroll, shrine. You see the shrine right there, and a menorah over here. Now, when I first used this in an exhibition called Sacred Realm, the Emergence of the Synagogue in the Ancient World, I read this as a Jewish artifact, but no, I don't think it is, and I'll show you why later. Okay, let's try this one. What we're looking at is a floor that was found north of Beit Sha'an, Scythopolis, at the end of the Jezreel Valley at the Jordan River, a synagogue from the 6th century. And it's a very nice synagogue. It's a beautiful mosaic. It was done by a fellow named Marianos and his son Kadina, the same team that built the synagogue at Beit Alpha. So we have a synagogue that was made for Jews and a synagogue that was made by for Samaritans, made by the same folks. On top of that, let's take a look at what you see here. You see Menorah A and Menorah B. You see a Torah shrine, a particularly nice one. In fact, when I've dealt with issues of color, this was always the one I like to use because it has such a rich palette and intricate use of polychromy in giving this art its expressiveness. But let's take a look. On either side of each menorah, and again, these are the same menorahs that Jews would have used, with the same rounded branches that Jews would have used, you see two objects. Well, one of them is easy to identify, right? The other one, let's leave it as less easy to identify. And you have one of them, two of them. One of them, two of them. You see right there? Very nicely decorated, the ram's horn. But what you don't see there is what you do see in this Jewish mosaic down below. Oops, sorry. In this Jewish mosaic down below. You see that square thing. You see the horn. And you see a palm frond tied to a willow and a myrtle with a citron, a etrog to the side. Ruth Jacoby, who taught in the one-year program at the Hebrew University, wrote a very smart essay where she pointed out that the lulav and the etrog are a specifically Jewish artifact. They were used by Jews, developed by Jews, maintained by Jews through late antiquity. You may know that Bar Kokhba wrote a letter making sure that there'd be sufficient palm fronds and citrons and the other stuff for his armies. Illustrated them on his coins. But it's a specific Jewish symbol. So if you see a menorah with a lulav and an etrog, you know it's Jewish. But let me tell you, Samaritans didn't come to that interpretation. They read the Etz Pri Hadar, the fruit of the goodly tree, and all that other stuff that becomes the lulav and the etrog, as make your hut for the festival of Sukkot out of fruit from all these trees. And so you will never find a lulav or an etrog on a Samaritan mosaic. Now, it may seem trivial. This object, this mosaic, is almost the same as this one. But remember, human beings live by trivial differences. In other words, it's the small differences that distinguish. And let me just say something that archaeologists often hate to say. Let's not interpret this too much. It is ancient linoleum. We can't overread it either. Within the Samaritan Synagogue at Bet Sha'an, there's a Greek inscription. And what does it say? God help Ephraim and Hanan. Great. God help Ephraim and Hanan. Two perfectly good biblical names. Ephraim being a particularly good name for Samaritans because they're of the tribe of Ephraim. That's great. And so here we see the small differences that make for the distinction between these communities streaming out at us. Let's try another one. Let's go back to our map. We're going to focus now on the synagogues in the area of Mount Gerizim, with particular emphasis on the synagogue at El Kherba, which was excavated in the 1980s by Yitzchak Magen and published soon after, as was Cherbet Samara, which we're going to use for support, and reference to other Samaritan synagogues, and set them in the context, again, of what we know about Jewish synagogues. Come on. Listen to it. Oh, I know. Good. Here we are at El Kherba. It's a relatively small room with benches on all sides. If you walk through the front door and look out, you'll see Mount Gerizim, because synagogues are oriented toward the Samaritan Holy Mountain. And so, like Jewish synagogues, you really couldn't differentiate this from a Jewish synagogue at this level of preservation. It's a reconstruction of what it seems to have looked like, with a beautiful mosaic at its center, which is really where we're going to put our emphasis, with a forecourt, with a colonnade. Very impressive, small public building in a relatively small village on the outskirts of Gerizim. And we're going to focus most on this wonderful mosaic, which you'll see is right here at the center of the floor. Now, if this were to show up in the antiquities department, in a storeroom, or in a museum somewhere, having been purchased in the 19th century, or at Sotheby's, we might have no idea that this is a Samaritan mosaic. When I was a student, and for every generation before, the go-to was to assume that you are looking here at a Jewish mosaic. And the best part is I can interpret everything you see here in strictly Jewish terms, except it's not a Jewish mosaic. Notice the use of Teos, one God, in the inscription. That might be a giveaway, or it might not be. To the right of that inscription, the facade of a small temple with double columns, maybe a Torah shrine, because you see the curtain opening before it. It's a shame that we can't see what's behind the curtain because it's destroyed. In the center, a perfectly nice table with a plate on it, and all sorts of delicious food, rolls, wine, a bowl full of whatever. And on the right, a menorah. Now, the menorah has a bunch of oil lamps on top, which is pretty uncommon for Jewish sites in late antique Palestine, where you usually find glass cups, but not unknown. So, for example, at the Synagogue at Hor, which is north of the Sea of Galilee, there are oil lamps as well. Usually there's cups, however, as we saw before. 2 ram's horns, one on each side, that square thing. Notice the base of the menorah. Now, I don't know exactly what this is, but let's try to figure it out together. On the left, you see the shrine. Images of shrines are really, really common in Samaritan art, as in this carved stone up above from the northern West Bank, as in this beautiful oil lamp, complete with menorah on the left, as in this mosaic from Chebet Samara. And so images of shrines are really common. And we have the same problem here that we have with Jewish mosaics. Is it the temple? Is it the synagogue shrine? Except the problem is that I don't know anything about synagogue shrines in late antique Samaritan synagogues this early. When you get to the Middle Ages, you have Torah shrines, but we don't have them this early. If this was a Jewish mosaic, my go-to answer is that when you see something like this, the image of the shrine plays a number of functions, just as the Ark of the Covenant and the Torah shrine do in rabbinic literature, where there is a coming together of the metaphors of the temple with the physicality of the synagogue. And so the synagogue looks like the temple, and the temple looks like the synagogue. And that's where I leave it. In other words, I don't make that distinction that here you see the temple and there you see the synagogue. I see the synagogue shrine as taking part in what I called in writing templization. And I saw somebody picked up on that recently. In other words, the synagogue becomes more temple-like, but at the same time, the temple becomes more synagogue-like in the Jewish imagination. That's what I would do with this if we're Jewish. The problem is that I don't know what Samaritans did with Torah shrines. Is this the biblical tabernacle? It would look like the image that Dora wrote was next to the priest. That would be okay, next to Aaron. Or is it similar to the Jewish usage? And the answer I have to give is that I don't know. Now, let me just stop there for a minute and point out that getting to the point where you've hit the end of the evidence and have to say, I don't know, is no crime. The students have read an article that I wrote about the synagogue stone from Magdala, which has a beautiful menorah on it and has been read as anything from, I don't know, Ezekiel's chariot to God knows what. And I came back and said, I don't really know what this stone does exactly. And I'm really not sure. And I don't think we know yet. And we're not going to know for a while. And I think we should just keep thinking about it rather than jumping to presumptions. Now, I know that that's not popular. It doesn't get us into National Geographic as fast. But sometimes it's important to just sit and stew over the problem. And this is a similar problem. This is the same problem. On the right is a beautiful piece of bone that was found in Bet Sha'an. The base of the menorah is distinctly like the one that you see at the hot springs of Tiberias in the bottom center. The base of both of them is very much like the base of the Samaritan menorah that you see on the far left. Remember, the Bible does not describe the shape of the base of the menorah. What you're looking at is a standard Roman lampstand with some branches added to it. So imagine this as a standard Roman lampstand and then 6 branches added on the sides. But besides that, if you found this piece of bone at the Rockefeller Museum, where it lives, and were to walk up to it where there's no label, you would know immediately that this is a Jewish artifact and not a Samaritan one. Not from the menorah in the center, but from the lulav on the left, separated from by a shofar, and the etrog on the right. That tells you straight out you're looking at a Jewish thing. Just like the one at the hot springs of Tiberias, just like all those twigs you find in the Roman catacombs and all over Asia Minor. The way you mark off a Jewish object is with a lulav and an etrog, and I can't say that more strongly. In other words, you always know it's not Samaritan, which is something that wasn't really a problem to think about until all this Samaritan material began to come together. And when seen as a corpus, it may not be a lot, but it raises question marks all the way through the system. But let's get back to this thing here. Now, when the first image of that thing was first published in 1928 from Capernaum, from Farnakum, the excavator, Arfali, said, oh, that's an incense shovel. But for the next 15 years, scholars guessed what it was. At first, E.L. Sukenik thought it was a scroll. I don't know how he thought it was a scroll, he did. Then he thought it was a reading table. And all along, Michael Aviona was saying, I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is. Somebody else said it was a charity box. And Aviona said, I don't know what it is. And all along, people are publishing all these absurd interpretations. And Aviona is saying, you know, we really don't know what it was until this piece came out of the ground. And Aviona said, look, this is nothing but a shovel. You cannot read this as anything but a shovel. It is an incense shovel. Now, I point out that I don't know which biblical incense shovel this is. There are a few different ones. But folks settled on the word machta, which is a particular biblical incense shovel, because in modern Hebrew, that seemed to make sense. They could have called it a yael, which is like a dustpan, but they didn't do that. They talked about a machta. Now, interestingly, Samaritans in the Middle Ages also referred to this object as a machta, so it helps both the Jewish interpretation and our understanding of the images, but that's for another matter. Notice the shovel here full of coals. Now we know what it is. Notice the shovel here in the Samaritan site. Notice the shovel here in the Samaritan site where you can see the coals on the shovel. We win. We have all we need to identify an object that Samaritans and Jews both use, just like they both use the lula, the shofar. Let's go back to our mosaic together. So we have the menorah. It has its bulbs and calyxes. It has a base like the one that we'd expect. It seems to have a horn over to the left. It has the lamps on top. Again, if you found this by itself, you would clearly think it was Jewish until very recently and assume that the lulav got lost or something, right? Not think twice about it. We saw the Torah shrine on the left, or the temple on the left, or the whatever it is on the left. But then there's a table in the middle. Let's think together for a little while about the table in the middle. Now, it is a standard Roman table. There's nothing unusual about it. It's jewel studded. It's very nice. And it has a metal tray on top. And the metal tray has all this nice surface decoration, these little X's or crosses, right? Or squares, or however you want to read, little flowers, however. Okay? And it has all these goblets, plus a very nice roll. And that's what it is. Now, what is this thing. I have a menorah on one side, I have a shrine on the left, and I have dinner in the middle. Well, there's our table again with those little white things. But let's go back to our plate from Nana together with its Torah shrine, with its menorah. Notice all the little flowers decorating its surface. Notice the color. We're dealing with a tray not so different from this one. Remember, Clement Gonneau identified this as Samaritan more than 100 years ago, based upon its relationship to the Aestheos inscription that was found near it when they were building a train track in the Ottoman period at Nana, otherwise known as Kibbutz Na'an, south of Lod. Now, let's look at this. Here you see a Torah shrine. But what you don't see is an etrog or even a palm frond. It's some other plant, it seems like. And so based upon the fact that there's not an etrog and a lulav for sure, and where it was found and how it's found, let's imagine it's Samaritan. Even if it's Jewish and not Samaritan, Samaritans would have had a similar plate, because we know that because dinner is served on this plate or something very similar to it. So there's our plate up above. So what's being served? Where do we have Jews serving stuff on plates? This is a gold glass from the Roman catacombs. You can see the beautiful Torah shrine, complete with scrolls inside laying down on shelves. You see oil lamps on top of the menorah. There's no lulav here. Yes, there's, excuse me, it's over here. No, I'm wrong. There's no lulav here. There is a lozenge that looks sort of like a Torah scroll. Down below, a table. And on the table, you can see a very happy looking fish. You can see his mouth, you can see his eyes, you can see his nose. And so here we have a cup that was purchased from the same manufacturer who would make a Christian cup or a cup for some other community, whose base was broken off and stuck into the plaster of one of the Jewish catacombs found in the 19th century, purchased by Maury and ends up at the Met. Here you see somehow having a communal meal with a fishy seems like a good idea as the lower register beneath the Torah shrine as the synagogue. And of course, eating communal meals with fishies were not so unusual. The one on the left is the Christian catacombs. So I could imagine that, let's play for a minute. What we're looking at here is a shrine and a menorah and some sort of communal dinner being illustrated together, maybe having something in common with each other, maybe just sort of stuck together without having defining frames. I could imagine that without very much difficulty. Again, the plate, the food, the fish. As soon as the Samaritan one was found, it was associated with this mosaic on the right. This is from the synagogue at Sipori, at Sepphoris. You can see it's a table too, with breads on the sides, breads on the top. It's a very, very odd image. I can tell you that the images that relate directly to Jewish biblical service in the Tabernacle at Sepphoris are of lower quality than the biblical scenes. This one seems to have taken a standard Roman temple and added a lot of little bread so that they can make the bread of the showbread, the bread of the presence, on a table. Remember, the scripture doesn't describe exactly what the table looks like, so this is how whoever made this mosaic sort of gerrymandered himself a table of the showbread. He didn't do a very good job. Having said that, you can see why when this was found, the immediate jump was, oh, look, go back. This must be the table of the showbread too. The problem, of course, is that the table of the showbread does not come with dinner, though it does come with cups on top, b'zichei levana, the containers for levona, for incense. So maybe the artist here made the table for the showbread the best way he knew how to make a table, and they said put cups and breads on top, so he put cups and breads on top, so it looks sort of like it just walked out of your last Friday night dinner. Maybe, possibly. After all, look at the table on the Arch of Titus as we were able to reconstruct it based upon a 3D scan. It's a standard Roman temple. Mr. Josephus describes the temple table as a Delphic table. Everyone knows what that is if you live in the Roman world. He also says that there are cups of frankincense up on top, and there you see them. Now, I just point out that there's no way in the world they could have carried this table through this parade with those cups sitting on top. So my guess is that whoever designed this bas-relief saw the table in the Temple of Peace and put the cups on top in his presentation. And this isn't a direct image of what happened when the holy vessels of Jerusalem were brought to Rome in 70, in the summer of 70. But still, we see this square table. Now, the problem with the table of the showbread is that it's such a difficult symbol, meaning it's so hard to identify, it's so uninteresting, that it took generations to figure out, finally, based upon the coin that you see on the left from the Second Jewish Revolt from Bar Kokhba, that we were actually looking at the image of the showbread table inside the gates of the temple in Bar Kokhba coins, and not all the Ark of the Covenant or a zillion other things that people came up with. It's just not a successful symbol. If I have to discuss the table of the showbread, as long as I have just discussed the table of the showbread with you, it is not as easy as, here, we use this, as this is, which is the preeminent Jewish visual marker, specifically because the more you simplify it, you still always identify it as a menorah. It's just a brilliantly unique artifact. I like to describe it as the golden arches of ancient Jewish history, or maybe Coca-Cola. Whoever began using this as a branding tool, and we know of it from the Hasmoneans, from the last of the Hasmonean kings in 39 BCE, Mattathias and Antigonus. It worked, and that's why it kept being used both by Jews and by Samaritans. But the table just didn't work. So, what is it? What you're looking at is an exquisite Torah case, which Samaritans call an aron. Notice Samaritan Torah cases are tripartite rather than the Sephardi Jewish ones, which are two-part. They have handles on the bottoms because Samaritan Torah scrolls are never read. They're used as icons in the synagogue. That's what we saw at the beginning with Najah Cohen, who is the priest who's holding this Torah scroll, holding it up. This is the most important of all Samaritan Torah scrolls. It's the Abisha Scroll, and this is the case of the images. The Abisha Scroll, they believe, goes back to the grandson of Aaron, the high priest, and was written at the gate of the Tabernacle on Mount Gerizim, just a number of years after the children of Israel went into the Holy Land. Modern scholars don't see it that way. They see it as a medieval text. But for Samaritans, the Abisha Scroll is their connection to eternity, to reality, to the foundation story of their community. Now, on this amazing piece of work, which comes from Damascus, you see the table of, the Ark of the Covenant, flanked by the rods of Aaron and Moses. It's labeled if you didn't know it. Down below, dedicatory inscription. And in front of the curtain of the temple, of the tabernacle, on the right, a menorah. I point out that the menorah branches are straight here and not round. By the time we get to the Middle Ages, Samaritans are making menorahs with straight branches, probably because the round branches are a distinct interpretation of the menorah as representing the path of the heavenly creatures, the planets, the sun, plus the sun of the moon that are visible. And so it represents the pathways of the planets through the heavens, which is what it continues to mean, but medieval people didn't always think in those terms. And Samaritans, and I point out, like Moses Maimonides and his son Abraham, son of Moses, all refrained from round branches and used straight branches. But that's not our subject. Let's go back to here. Here we see the table of the showbread. Those little circles, they represent the breads. The word to their right, lechem. So, and underneath hapanim, lechem, the bread of the presence. So this is the lechem hapanim as somebody imagined it in the 16th century, based upon medieval forms, because what you see here in the various elements illustrated here are not late Islamic Ottoman period shapes, but high medieval 12th and 13th century shapes. That's pretty cool. But look what's on top of the table. Cups. Now, good. So we had cups here. Oops. We have food here. We have cups here. Maybe this is the table of the showbread. I don't know. Let's try it again. What you see here is a drawing on the right that I'm lucky that I received in the mail after only 2 years of trying from the National Library in Moscow about 2 months ago. I don't think I'd get it today because people wouldn't be able to send it to me, not because they wouldn't want to. What you're looking at is a drawing that dates to the 16th century, 17th century, early 17th century. It's dated, of the tabernacle. You see the curtains around this periphery, the table, the Ark of the Covenant in the center. Notice the cherubs up above, the menorah to the right, the table to the left, and it works its way down. Here you see the incense burner, which is labeled machtah, so that's pretty good. In other words, if an incense burner is called a machtah, it's a good indication that that thing that appears in Samaritan synagogues and in Jewish synagogues may be machtah as well. So we have pre-modern people making that association. We have the Kior Nechoshet, the brazen laver of the temple. But what I really want to focus in on is this guy. What you see here is the table of the showbread. And on its side, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 12 breads, 2 hooks for carrying it on each side, and on top, a whole array of cups. Now, Samaritans kept making these drawings of the tabernacle after the 17th century, but we don't have any. But in the late 19th and early 20th century, they started making tourist wear drawings of the tabernacle. And what you see on the left is a not particularly nice one that is in the collection at the Hebrew College in Cincinnati, with the table, which they didn't know exactly what to do with. But above it, not knowing exactly what to do with it, you see 2 drinking cups and a bottle of something. So the Samaritans, who knew this is a table of showbread, in wanting to show a table, put the cups for the levana, the bizichel levana, for the frankincense, and at the center they put this big bottle right down here to tell you it's a table with a bottle. I'm sorry, table with a bottle. Now, if that's the case, what do I do with this? What is it? Is this dinner? Or is this the table of the showbread that the artisan didn't know exactly how to reproduce it? My interpretation before I started playing with the Samaritan material was that this image should be read together with this image on the gold glass, or this image from the Christian catacombs, that it's some sort of dinner that goes on in the Samaritan synagogue. And that still could be true. But there's such a thing as just a bad artist, as you see here on the right, where he took a table and gerrymandered it into the table for the showbread. It seems that that's sort of what's going on. Because after all, when Samaritans are in control and are making sophisticated drawings of the tabernacle using medieval art most of the time, and I just added as an aside, notice these curtains and flowers, which are sort of Ottoman flourishes to the drawings. When they do it, it looks an awful lot like my mosaic, but without the breads. Now, all of this is to say that sometimes later interpretation can give us a certain number of tools that we can use to add hard questions. Let's go one more step. What you see here is the mosaic at El Kherva on the left, and I've imposed the color just because it's pretty. Notice that on the far side, on the western side, the western side, there's a geometric pattern. Samaritans never use images of animals. In fact, at Khirbet Samara, they have a bird cage without a bird, because they simply never make images of things in the heavens above or the earth below, which you cannot say about Jews in this period, for whom that was not an issue. A round pattern, which we can't tell what it is, toward the eastern side, since this is horizontal, since this is vertical, below the menorah panel, though you know it's a floor, so it's not above or below. Take a look at the floor in the synagogue at Sepphoris, where at the far end is the Torah shrine. There it is, the Torah shrine with 2 menorahs. In the center, you can't see him, but that little bell with the feet, that's Aaron the high priest in front of the tabernacle with sacrificial animals to the left. And this artist being so good that when he wanted to draw more sacrificial animals, he put them in another square down below and connected the ones up above to the ones down below with a biblical verse. In other words, he's not so good. And when he wanted to show more temple stuff, he just sort of had them floating in the air, the flour, the oil, and the horns. And then on the right, the table of the basket of showbread, which he did do very nicely. And in the center, our very strange table. Now notice it's above a circular object as well, except in the Jewish synagogue, it is the zodiac. And so the placement of the table in the Samaritan synagogue and in the Jewish synagogue is more or less the same place, right in the middle of the hall. Just above, and again, I use that word with caution, the image of something round. But having said that, the differences are in the nuances. Now, notice on the left that fellow holding the scroll at Dora Ropos, who's been given more interpretations than there are people who've ever held a Torah scroll, though through strictly internal dynamics of the Dora Ropos synagogue, I think it's, for me at least, it's pretty clear that we're looking at Moses, because Moses is the fellow who appears most. And after all, in Jewish history, almost everybody who holds a scroll is derivative of Moses. Ezra is written as the new Moses, and so the identification of this guy as Ezra only points back to Moses. So it doesn't matter, because next to him is Najach Cohen. Now, Najach is on Mount Gerizim. Sometimes he's in the synagogue. He is the cantor of the community, waving the Holy Scroll for all to see. The fellow on the left at Dora is holding his scroll like some sort of Roman philosopher, but don't worry, the text is bleeding right out the back, so you know there's writing on the other side. In Najach's case, the case of the Torah contains the image of the tabernacle. And remember that the Samaritan Torah case is called an aron. Two communities, two very different communities who have much in common. The two Israels of the flesh coming together to give us a very local picture through a number of very specific examples of how these two Israelite peoples interact and complement our understanding, when read together, of the complexities of art in late antiquity. Let me just point out that I could have given the same lecture based upon poetry and liturgy, but that's not for today. And I could have given the same lecture based upon their biblical interpretation, and that's not for today. But it is for another day, because what you've just heard is a part of a larger project, the Yeshiva University Israelite Samaritan Project, which includes a volume that I edited, published by Brill just now, called The Samaritans of Biblical People, an exhibition that opens in Washington and then in Germany in the fall and the spring on the same subject, and a full documentary, all of the same title, with the intention of bringing the Samaritan material into popular conversation, into scholarly dialogue, and giving them the place they've always deserved, but haven't had in our understanding of the world of late antiquity. Thanks so much. You turn this thing off. Start video. Are you there?
Thanks so much for that wonderful lecture.
Stop there. There we are.
Yeah, you're all set. That's great.
Hello, everybody. We have questions, comments, discussions, and I hope all you students wrote things down that we can talk about.
So I'd like to invite everyone to put questions in the chat, and I will read them, or at Professor Fine's request, if students have questions and you'd like to identify yourselves, if you don't, put it in the chat and I will read it as we've grown accustomed to doing that. But if you would like to identify yourself and raise your hand, he would like to call on you and talk to you directly.
Sure, it's more fun. Who's up first? Yisraela.
Can the Humanities Center unmute Rabbi Yisraela for us, please? Thanks.
No, she's muted. We did it.
Yay.
Hello.
Hi. So all of those Samaritan sites that don't have the lulav, does that change I think I missed this part where the table with the various things on the table, the bread or the cups, were there any of those also associated with the lulav in the picture?
No.
Okay.
Oh, you know what? At Sepphoris, yes. And this is complex because the Hokuk excavation is complex. You have to ask Jody because they found a table of the showbread and it's labeled table of the showbread.
Was it the same kind that had, I mean, it's the cups and
Theirs
the
is
things
better.
on top?
Theirs doesn't have cups. Theirs has breads.
Just breads. Okay.
That's what it's supposed to have, you know.
Right. Well, it's just really curious because it sounds like, you know, there's some cross-pollination going on there.
There's complete cross-pollination. That's what's so interesting. And it's, we all know it's the small differences that make people hate each other or like each other. In this case, it's Mount Gerizim and separate elements of their Torah that's different, and ways of living that are just different enough. But in Tannaitic times, in the 2nd century, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel could say any mitzvah that the Samaritans keep, they keep better than we do. That wasn't always the opinion. It depends on the moment in the year and from both sides.
And
it takes two to dislike each other for 3,500 years.
And I had another question, if that's okay. Okay, the other question was in the Torah shrines, there's these round circular things as opposed to like the scroll that we keep in a Torah shrine today or in the Ark today. Are like all the scrolls the separate books?
Yes. No, here's the deal. You know, when I went to Yeshiva, I was paranoid, or not paranoid, very careful that a Torah book goes on top of a Talmud book, and a Talmud book goes on, and a Mishnah book goes on top of a Talmud book, asserting the authority of each book based upon how I stacked it. I didn't know that that was something that goes way back, because in antiquity, scrolls were written. Scrolls were scrolls, and they were laid down within their cabinets. And so what you were seeing was the ends of the scrolls laying down in their cabinets. If it was in a box, you would put the Torah scrolls on top, and you would put the writings on the prophets underneath and the writings under that to assert canonicity, right? And that's why laying down is the standard way to keep books in a world, in that world. When Jews kept using scrolls after everyone else stopped, they stopped keeping their scrolls the way everyone else had kept them. And so, and the scrolls got bigger. After all, in antiquity, if you saw Moses in Dura-Ropos, the scroll is about as big as his forearm, which is about as big as a Dead Sea Scroll, about 18 inches. About as big as any of the papyri from Herculaneum. Nothing's ever any bigger than that. But Torah scrolls can be bigger, can be almost a yard tall today. In other words, there's been inflation in the size of the scroll, and hence setting it vertically within the case.
Thanks. Why don't we go to one of the students? Dylan has a question, and I will unmute you.
Dylan, you're on. You have to unmute though.
All right, sweet. Yeah, I just had a question of basically, because you kind of bring up like a like craftsmanship about the text, the Mosaic text, and it's something I've never considered before, like reassembling the Mosaic. But it just I'm just curious. So it kind of seems like the Samaritans, at least when they are writing the Mosaic text, do you think it's just messy on their part, or do you think it's messy just reconstructing it? Yeah, I just feel like there's like this, I don't know if my question's well formulated or anything, but
let me try it. Okay,
like
you tell me if I got it right.
Yeah.
Right.
Is there like craftsmanship like not as like fine-tuned, or like they're embracing messiness in that regard? And that's kind of my question.
Much of the messy you see is because the floor is 2,000 years old or slightly less, right? And it got broken and it got walked on and it got smashed, right?
Yeah.
And the fact that it exists shows you how smart they were to invest in mosaics rather than carpets, which don't last as long. And that's why they still exist, okay? Because they were smart enough to not want to keep replacing their carpets all the time, which were very expensive. Now, having said that, if you go near Gaza, there's a synagogue at a place called Nerim, and it has a beautiful mosaic with a beautiful menorah and animals, and it's wonderful. The one thing that's awful there is the Hebrew script. Why is the Hebrew script awful? Because the person who did it spoke Greek. It's like, watching Americans who aren't used to writing in Hebrew trying. It just looks awful, right? So these Samaritans, or the people they hired to make their mosaics and make their inscriptions as best they could, were not as fluent in the script. And since the script in many of those cases was used for strictly symbolic purposes, it's sort of like going to a Jewish cemetery where no one can read the thing that's written on the tombstone, but it has to be there. And then you see all these ghastly misspellings, right? And no one knows it until someone like me or Yisrael walks in there, or Debbie, right? And we walk in there and say, "Oh, look what they did." But no one knows it because the Hebrew being there is enough. It has a magical connection.
Sweet. Thank you.
Did I get to your question?
Yeah, no, you did. You
Okay.
did. Yeah, that translation, just seeing that. So it was like slow. It wasn't so much the craftsmanship, it was just the translation. Because of if I'm reading what you're saying, that translation.
Look, Samaritan written by a Samaritan in Samaria looks really good. Samaritan written by a contemporary Samaritan who's 80 years old looks pretty good. Samaritan written by a young guy who speaks Hebrew or Arabic all the time and works on his computer all the time doesn't look as good.
I see. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks. I have a question, and as people write more questions in the chat or raise your hand, you mentioned the exciting exhibition that you're working on that's coming out. And I know in class we've looked at your work on the Arch of Titus, and we've seen the video of the polychromy and all the reconstructions, all this really exciting stuff that you do, sort of hands-on things. And I wanted to ask if you could talk to the students a little bit about the importance of doing that kind of stuff alongside your written scholarship. Why you do both, and why it's important to do both.
Let me start out by saying that I see as well as I read, and I'm lucky that I couldn't read real well because of an eye problem until about 5th grade. And so I learned how to see because I was a smart kid who couldn't read well. So I learned to do perspective in museums because that I could see. And so my visual memory and my love of stuff that you can touch is really important. And so I'm one of those people who grew up in museums and loving museums and being with the material and knowing that you can look at my cups. See, I made them. You can look at my cups all you want, but until you own one, it's no fun whatsoever, right? And touched it and did with it, or the oil lamps that are around my house or whatever. An oil lamp is an oil lamp, but it's different once you've touched it. I remember when I brought the gold glass to the exhibition and I was able to pick it up, I thought to myself, oh, it's much lighter than I thought. And that was important information, being able to touch, to smell, to look at, to be close to the stuff we're studying. I try not to write about anything that I don't get to see and touch. And there are some exceptions like Dora Ropos, but when I was a graduate student, I went to a museum in Israel, made myself 50%, just like the model, and sat there for an hour and tried to imagine the space. And so it's very important for me, this spatial, this tactile, and I love museums. And so from a very young age, as an undergraduate, I was volunteering and working in museums. But then I found out along the way that I was pretty good at this research thing, and that working in a museum is a really fun thing, but it's often like being a librarian. You don't have time for creative as much as others. And there was this wonderful thing I heard of called tenure, which I didn't know existed. And I thought that's a really good thing. And I was pushed by my teachers to go back, and as been a curator of archaeology at USC, to go back and write my PhD. And so I've always been really close to the objects. That's why the color thing worked for me. It made sense to me that the curators got it right and that the scholars got it wrong, or that the academics got it wrong. They're all scholars. It's clear to me that it made sense to me. I was willing to countenance the notion that the curators could get it right, just like I can countenance the notion that archivists are going to teach me something about the stuff I'm looking at that I'm not going to get by reading in a book. Right? I can tell you the stuff I've gotten because some archivists liked me and said, have you noticed this? Have you looked at that? Oh, that I would have never had otherwise. And so I'm very close to the pulse of the stuff that I study and where it lives. I like bringing that to the bigger world. I truly believe that scholarship, when it's kept in its $150 books, is being buried. Good, important information that the world can really gain from, right? Ways of seeing ourselves and the place where we live are lost because scholars start thinking that writing for their 5 peers in 4 different Ivy League universities is enough. And so coming from that kind of museum background, I was really fortunate when I was a graduate student and this museum director stopped me in Israel and said, wouldn't you like to do an exhibition about your synagogue stuff? And I was like, God, yeah. And so I found myself with the best supported Jewish exhibition ever from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Sacred Realm, the emergence of the synagogue in the ancient world. Then I wanted to try out Titus. I wanted to see what he would look like in 3D if we were to really print it. We did the scan, we had the color, we figured it out. We went step by step through it. I'm sure you saw, we were sort of nervous at every single stage as we kept moving forward. And then it was like, oh, look what we did. I wonder what it would look like for real. So we tried it and happily have this rich friend who paid for it. It's even better. And so we created this exhibition that brought an awful lot of people where we could talk about stuff that people usually think is boring, but it's not boring when you put all these wonderful 18th century drawings next to the colors changing before your eyes. Or the Samaritans, it's going to be built. The project is built around our documentary film, which is amazing. I've got to tell you, we did the premiere in New York. We're going to be at festivals coming up. It's going to be available to be shown all over not too long from now. You would think it's about boring Samaritans, but it's really about you and me and how we live in the world and how the Samaritans live in the world and how as a small population, they can teach us a lot about us, how the micro people wants to continue. It's an amazing, amazing film, but the exhibition is built around films where you can walk in and be a participant in the Passover sacrifice. We hid all the blood. Where you can walk in and watch them making a sukkah. You can walk in and hear 6 old people telling stories. We asked them, what would you want your grandchildren to know? And we were creating it as much for them as we were creating it for us. Because now these people, one of whom's already dead, have created stories that their grandchildren will keep and that we've done something good for them. And on, I keep going and going and going, but when you come to the exhibition, it is so multisensory, along with the big rocks. That stone that I showed you from Thessalonica and the one from Delos, they're all coming to Washington, where you can get up close and see how good the script is or isn't, and not believe me or look at some damn screen again. And so it's another way of interpretation. Exhibition is like book writing. It's like movie making. It's like painting. It's like writing a poem. It's another creative outlet. And I'm fortunate that people let me play with this creative outlet every so often. It's also exhausting. But by writing a book that's wonderful and full of essays and colorful and big and inexpensive, because we've funded it. It says Brill, but it costs $68 retail. And a cookbook. We have a Samaritan cookbook, and we have a Samaritan children's book based on those stories coming out. And what am I trying to do? I'm trying to get you to pay attention, Chris, to Samaritans. That's the whole point. I am so tired of scholarship being based upon Jews and Christians as if they're a binary. When here are these other people, they are published, they are well known to everybody who does anything with Samaritans and nobody else. Right? And so the goal, I'm happy to say that my friend Laura Lieber, I bugged her, Debbie, you heard this for how long? Laura, don't you want to look at the Samaritan poetry? It's beautiful. Year after year after year. Laura, don't you want to read the Samaritan poetry? Finally, she sort of pampered me and went and looked them up, and now her translation of Samaritan poetry has just come out. Because it is beautiful. But remember, what I study is Jews. And this is another set of binoculars that lets me focus on the people I really care about knowing about. Samaritans, whom I've learned to love, are a sideline, just like for me, Christianity is a sideline when I teach New Testament, right? Just like when I do, I don't know, Art of Titus color, it's a sideline. But all of those sidelines allow me the angles to look into the center of what I'm really studying, which is John Q. Judean walking through the Galilee, or through Sardis, or through Rome. But I have to understand Rome, Sardis, and whatever in order to do it. And when you exhibit, sometimes you see things better. And so I know it's a long answer, but that's where I live. And so, guys, if you're at all interested in this stuff, scholarship is great. It's the basis of everything. Get your languages down, get your objects down, become such that you know them better than anybody else. But then the question is, how do I tell them about it? And that's the point at which I started doing exhibits.
Oh, that's great. Thanks. We have time for one more question. And Professor Green has a question that she's typed in. Can
Yes,
we
Professor Green.
distinguish between a wine goblet or cup and a cup that would have held frankincense?
Look, the one on the Arch of Titus is just this big round cup, right? It's a big oblong thing. There's no cups in the Roman world called frankincense cups. So a cup is a cup is a cup is a cup. You know, I can keep sugar in here. Right? In fact, Talmudic literature talks about the manna being kept in a glass cup next to the Ark of the Covenant. Now, there were no glass cups in biblical times. There were big glass bottles, like the ones you find for funerary purposes to this day. You go to the Met and see them, right? So what's it talking about? Big glass bottle. When I want to understand what it's talking about, I look at my Corning Glass Museum catalog and start putting it together.
Me too, but I guess what I'm wondering about is, so Steve, you said, Professor Fines, I'm sorry. So you said,
yeah, Debbie.
so you said that, when we're looking at those tables, I'm just wondering, in the imagery, can you start to perceive a difference in those cups? Because they do seem like they're in a way, in those different images, they're different in a way. So I'm wondering if maybe eventually we'll be able to identify one from another, or are they really just all going to be cups that were for anything?
Here's the problem. This isn't Christian art where there's 18 of everything and they've all been cataloged at Princeton, right? In the Christian index of Christian art. There's half a mosaic, like the ones I just showed you, and that's all there is. And so it's a different process. My expectation is always of nothing. And then when I get something, I'm surprised. Look, I had to go all the way through the 16th century in order to begin to make sense. When I went through that thing with the shovel, I have an article coming out about the shovels and the craziness of people trying to interpret them. And you know that when I talk about the shovels and the interpreting, I'm talking about mosaics of elephants that have been read as anything and everything. And what's his name? And Moses's that have been read as anything but everything. And that little square thing at Magdala that looks like it has monkeys running around it in 2001: A Space Odyssey. And this is monolith. Overinterpretation. And sometimes the simple that comes from being in close contact with the real stuff, whether it's the real languages and materials that you do, or whether it's the gardens that you do, or the rocks that I do, right? The close contact with the material for a historian is a kind of control. Because as we historians can all tell you, our job is to be synthetic, to be exciting, to make things come together. We're not archaeologists. Their job is to find stuff and to publish it and to make sense of it at that level. And not their job is not higher criticism, it's lower criticism. And that's good because they're good at it. But when we do it, we sometimes fly higher than the clouds unnecessarily. That's my take. And so with the cups, I'm lucky to have what I have. And when I have it, I'm surprised.
Well, please join me in thanking Professor Fine for his wonderful talk and wonderful question and answers. Please join us for their next lecture in our series next Monday, May 9th, when Yash Elster will speak to us about Dura Europos and its conceptual context between Eurasian fantasy and Mandate archaeology. The lecture is free and open to the public, but Zoom registration is required. You can register on the Oregon Humanities Center website, and information can be found on the OHC website and the university's events calendar. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody.